in this pleasant evening. And thanks to the Society of Renal Nutrition and Metabolism to invite me to give you a talk on the management of CKD patients in the intensive care unit. So this is going to be the outline of my talk, outcomes of COVID-19 in CKD SRD patients, and what is the inflammatory pathogenesis and how it helped in changing the therapeutics, and what is the ICU management in COVID-19 patients, and what evidences do we have and how we apply it practically, and at last, what are the role of immunomodulators in the severe COVID. So this is a publication which came last month in the CJASN about the outcomes of COVID-19 in CKD patients. We don't have any particular study pertaining to CKD patients, and this is from the data collected from 33 centers from their electronic medical record, which included about 1.5 lakh patients with COVID-19, and among them, 8,800 patients were CKD patients, and 1,43,000 patients were non-CKD. So what they have done is they have seen three outcomes. What about the mortality, ventilation, and hospitalization? When they have seen without matching their baseline characteristics and the underlying comorbidities apart from CKD, they found that those patients with CKD have a huge amount of mortality rate and the ventilator dependency and the rate of hospitalization. And what they did is they matched these two cohorts by propensity matching algorithm for age, sex, and multiple comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes. So after matching also, what they have found is the outcome difference was significant. The mortality rate, the dependency on ventilation, and the rate of hospitalization was about 1.5 times higher. Even in the subgroup analysis, those patients who were with severe CKD and moderate CKD, their mortality, ventilation, and the hospitalization rate was much higher. Even those patients with moderate CKD with COVID-19, their rate for need for renal replacement therapy was significantly higher when compared to those without moderate CKD. And hence, irrespective of the severity of the CKD, their rate of mortality, ventilation, and the hospitalization was higher in patients with COVID-19 and CKD. So this is another analysis which gave us about the outcomes of patients with kidney disease and severe COVID-19 who are in the critical care unit. So this is a retrospective cohort study where they have identified 4,000 patients from 68 ICUs. What they have looked is the 28 days mortality. What they have noticed is those patients without kidney disease have a mortality of about 35% in their ICUs, but those patients who are dialysis dependent and those patients who are having underlying chronic disease, the absolute death rate was 50%. This was consistent with the previous study what I have shown. Approximately the mortality rate is about 1.5 times higher compared to those patients who do not have kidney disease. So when we look into what was the therapy that they have given, whether is there any difference in the therapy in patients with and without CKD, these are the two therapies which has a mortality benefit, that is use of corticosteroids and anticoagulation. It was almost similar in all the cohorts. Only two things which was different was the therapy on remdesivir and tocilizumab. Since remdesivir, there are no data on patients who have CKD and who are dialysis dependency, they have not used much. And the tocilizumab, although they have used, the rate was only 10%. And if we see the illness severity and the laboratory findings of critically ill COVID-19 patients, the laboratory finding, what they have found was this D-dimer, ferritin, TROP-T, TROP-I were all significantly higher in maintenance hemodialysis patients compared to those without having chronic kidney disease. So coming to the overview of COVID-19 inflammatory pathogenesis, as we all know, in a pandemic speed, we gain the knowledge on the pathogenesis of this disease also. So this disease has three phases. The first one is the pulmonary phase, which will be followed by the pro-inflammatory phase, which will be followed by the prothrombotic phase. About 80% of the patients will have self-recovering illness. 15 to 20% will enter into this pro-inflammatory phase. Among them, only 5% will have the severe cytokine storm and they will land up in the ICU. So what happens in the pulmonary phase? To say briefly, this SARS-CoV-2 utilizes the ACE2 receptor, which are present in the type 2 pneumocytes. So what it causes a state of ACE2 deficiency. Normally, this ACE2 is needed to convert this angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1-7. This angiotensin 1-7 is a protective molecule where it causes vasodilatation and it is anti-inflammatory. Since there is no ACE2 and it is down-regulated, there will be a state of higher angiotensin 2 in the pulmonary vasculature system, and it causes vasoconstriction and it is pro-inflammatory and pro-fibrotic, as we know. So it is detrimental, and this creates a state of local and systemic high angiotensin state. So this virus can have direct toxic effect on the type 2 pneumocytes, and it can cause RAS imbalance. And this is found to be one of the most clinically relevant molecular mechanism for overall progression in the COVID pneumonia. Another thing what to note is, if this angiotensin 2 level goes up in the lungs, this can act on the AT1R receptors and it can activate ADAM17. The consequence will be there will be release of more and more soluble TNF alpha, which can aggravate the inflammation and it leads to pro-inflammatory state. So targeting this phase, the therapies came in. The first was the RAS inhibitors. Previously, there was a controversy whether we can give RAS inhibitors to those patients with COVID. Now it is well clear, those patients who are on ACE or ARBs, we can continue it unless there is a contraindication like worsening renal function. And in this phase, to prevent the viral entry, we use azithromycin in patients with mild disease. There are mechanisms in that this ACE2, the binding of the virus to the ACE2 needs a co-receptor, and this co-receptor is blocked by azithromycin. And once the virus enters into the cell, it is dependent upon the host RDRP, that is RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, to synthesize and replicate its own RNA, and there acts this drug remdesivir, favipiravir, and the ribavirin. And protease inhibitors were tried like lopinavir, ritonavir, which prevents the formation of the protein products which are necessary for the coating of the virus. So once this phase crosses, we do have the pro-inflammatory phase, and this is because there will be release of PAMs and DAMs, which can cause more and more inflammatory response. And usually it depends upon which patient will go for pro-inflammatory phase. Those who have higher viral inoculum, who have taken more and more of viruses, those patients, they will be going for this pro-inflammatory phase. So why it happens? Normally, if a cell gets infected with virus, the adjacent cells will produce interferons to protect themselves. But because of some unknown reasons, there is early antagonism of interferon response in patients affected with severe COVID. And this virus has the ability to kill lymphocytes. It is very evident, we will be seeing very severe lymphopenia in those patients with COVID-19. So because of these antagonism of the innate immune response by the virus, there will be excessive inflammatory cytokine release to compensate for the exhausted immune system. And this leads to a state of hyperinflammation. When this goes uncontrolled, there will be cytokine storm. The cytokines which are produced in the pulmonary vasculature will enter into the systemic circulation and it cause multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. So targeting this pro-inflammatory phase, many therapies have evolved. The most important being the corticosteroids, which has proven a mortality benefit, and the IL-6 inhibitors, we will see it about it later, and the other therapies which has been tried, and many papers have been published on TNF-alpha inhibitors, VEGF inhibitors, JAK inhibition, and even anti-malarial drugs, what we used previously, this chloroquine and the hydroxychloroquine. It's an immunomodulator and it has some effect on the pro-inflammatory phase, and the convalescent plasma therapy, which has a role of neutralizing the virus. So if the patient goes in for a pro-inflammatory phase, simultaneously they will land up in a pro-thrombotic phase. Now, what has been thought is this virus is prone to cause thromboinflammation in the pulmonary vessels. This virus, because of RAS overactivation, more and more of angiotensin 2, it causes endothelial damage and hyperinflammation, as well as this SARS-CoV-2 can act on the ACE2 receptors, which are present in the endothelium, and it can cause what is called as thromboinflammation. So what they have found in the autopsy is they were able to find thrombosis in small to medium sized pulmonary vessel. This probably has migrated from the deep veins in the lower system or an in situ formation of the thrombosis in the pulmonary vessel. And what they have also noticed is the alveolar microthrombi. That is, they have found this microthrombi in the capillary circulation also, and it is a platelet-rich microthrombi. Hence, this prothrombotic phase is targeted by vitamin K antagonist. The antiplatelets do have a role in mild cases. There are some studies which have shown benefit because whatever the thrombi has been studied or rich in platelets. That's the reason why people are using antiplatelets and anti-10A agents, that is heparin and direct thrombin inhibitors. So this is the natural course of COVID-19, where the stage 1 sets in. About 80% of the patients will have this mild infection and they will resolve on its own. Those who had higher viral inoculum, they will enter into a phase of stage 2, that is pulmonary phase, and subsequently they will go for hyperinflammation phase. So what are the key components in intensive care unit management in CKD patients? This is not much different from a non-CKD patients, but This statement holds true regarding to our population. Absence of evidence of benefit is not evidence of absence for benefit. We do not have much studies pertaining to CKD patients because all the trials, whatever has been conducted in COVID-19, they have taken patients with GFR of more than 30. So we are extrapolating those treatment in our CKD populations also. So what are the key components in ICU care? Oxygen therapy, antivirals, anti-inflammatory, anticoagulation, immunomodulators, and the supportive therapy. Whenever possible, the patient will be advised on proning, even if the patient is on ventilator, and renal replacement therapy. And make sure in this CKD population, we have to avoid nephrotoxins. So whenever a patient lands up in ICU, we first assess the severity of hypoxemia by the PF ratio, and we will categorize them as mild, moderate, or severe ARDS. And the goal of the oxygen therapy is to maintain the adequate tissue oxygenation and to decrease the symptoms of hypoxemia. And we target an SpO2 of about 90 to 92% in ICU. Do not hyperoxygenate the patient, because if we target in an intubated patient of more than 96 saturation, it can lead to lung injury. And there are various oxygen delivery systems that we use in our ICU. These are all available in almost all the hospitals, and we do use in our ICUs regularly. And there are variable performance system where the FiO2 is not fixed. That depends upon the patient's tidal volume, how much he inhales, the FiO2 varies. So if a patient comes, initially we'll try with the nasal prongs with 1 to 6 liters. If the requirement goes up, we will try with the face mask, which can deliver a flow of about 6 to 10 liters. And still, if the patient is not maintaining adequate saturation, what we target, then we will go for this non-rebreathing mask. This mask is widely used in this COVID-19. See, this mask is called non-rebreathing reservoir mask. This has a reservoir of about 1 liter capacity, and there is a one-way valve here, and which is connected to the oxygen supplier. So what it does is, whenever the patient inhales, the valve opens and the oxygen from this reservoir bag goes to the patient. And when the patient expires, the valve gets closed and the expired air goes out. By the time the patient expires, this bag will get refilled by the inflowing oxygen from the oxygen delivery system. By this, using this NRBM, we can deliver higher FiO2 and we can prevent the wastage of oxygen, because whenever the patient expires, the oxygen gets filled in this bag. So to keep this bag always refilled, it needs about 10 liters of flow. And we do have Venturi mask, which can give a predictable FiO2. So with all these stepwise escalation of the oxygen therapy, we tend to target an SpO2 of about 90 to 90% in the ICU. And we do not over-oxygenate them. Suppose if the patient do not attain this saturation with even 15 liters non-rebreathing mask, and if the patient has moderate ARDS on ABG, and if the patient is tachypnic, we will next go with this non-invasive modes of ventilation. Preferably, we will try with the CPAP, and if the patient needs pressure support, then we will switch over to the BiPAP. And when the patient is on non-invasive ventilation, we'll monitor the SpO2, respiratory rate, and the breathing pattern. So clinically, we'll assess the respiratory rate and the work of breathing. If the patient is not tolerating, and if you are not attaining a saturation of about 90%, and if the work of breathing increases, and if the FiO2 requirement goes up, we do not delay intubation. We'll proceed with intubation. And there is another one system which we commonly use in our ICU is the high flow nasal oxygen system. The indications are almost the same. Either we can use non-invasive ventilation like CPAP or BiPAP or HFNC. And what it does, there is a flow meter through which the oxygen comes in, and there is a blender here which mixes with the gas, and this mixed gas is passed to the humidifier where it is heated and it is supplied to the nasal interface through this tubing. This can deliver an FiO2 of about 20 to 100%, and maximum flow that we can obtain is about 16 liters, and it can deliver a heated, humidified, high flow, high FiO2 oxygen, and it can even generate extensive PEEP. So the same things we'll be monitoring, what we do monitoring for the NID or BiPAP patient, and we use an index called ROX index. It is like a SpO2 by FiO2 by respiratory rate. At 6 hours, we will be assessing. If it is less than 3.5, probably the HFNC is failing. Try for BiPAP, CPAP. If the patient is not tolerating, then go ahead with the intubation. And with the evolving pathogenesis, now it has been well documented that COVID ARDS is different from other ARDS. In a way, this COVID ARDS, what has been seen is the lung is a compliant lung, whereas in the non-COVID ARDS, it is a non-compliant lung. Why so? Because the COVID ARDS, the involvement is more of interstitium. We have done lots and lots of CCs. What we see is the ground glass opacity. That is because of the involvement of the interstitium. And there is non-alveolar edema. The edema is not in the alveolum, it is in the interstitium. And what has been well studied now is this vascular involvement is more and the shunting is more, or the VQ mismatch, which is the reason why the patients are more hypoxic. So the lung weight by the CT, it is less because there is much less fluid, and we can manage these patients with less PEEP. Whereas in non-COVID ARDS, their lung is non-compliant. There will be both alveolar as well as interstitium edema, and their lung weight by the CT is high because it's a wet lung, and we do need more PEEP. Always, if the patient worsens on ventilator, always rule out pneumothorax, because it is well noted. We have experienced so many patients in our ICU that they have developed a pneumothorax because this virus itself can cause a pneumothorax. It's not because of the iatrogenic thing, and the pulmonary embolism if deterioration is noted. So coming to the next treatment, that is antiviral. This remdesivir, it is a pendulum in this pandemic where the evidence goes and again for and against this remdesivir. We will see what evidences are currently in practice. So it's a nucleotide analog, and it is an RDRP inhibitor, and it prevents RNA replication. This is the first randomized multi-center double-blind placebo-controlled trial, that is an ACTT trial, where they use remdesivir for about 10 days. See, it's important to know whom they have included. They have included patients who have radiographic infiltrates by imaging. That means those have lung involvement on imaging and SpO2 of less than 94% on room air, or those who are requiring supplemental oxygen or requiring mechanical ventilation. What the endpoint, what they have kept was the time to recovery. So in this study, there was no mortality benefit, but what they have found was there is a faster time to recovery in patients who are receiving low flow oxygen at baseline. No difference in time to recovery in patients on non-invasive ventilation or mechanical ventilation or ECMO. And this is the solidarity trial, which is ongoing, and WHO has published the interim results last month. And with that, they are not suggesting remdesivir to use in any kind of hospitalized patients because they did not find any mortality difference at 28 days. So what is the role in CKD patients? As I have shown here, those patients who are having a GFR of less than 30 were excluded in almost all the trials. So what is the drug's potential toxicity in patients with kidney disease? See, the remdesivir itself can cause mitochondrial injury in the renal tubular epithelial cells. That can happen only after prolonged exposure, but it is very rare to occur within a 5 to 10 day therapy course. And what we worried much is the accumulation of the cyclodextrin carrier, because it is predominantly excreted through the glomerular filtration. What has been shown in animal studies are this cyclodextrin carrier can cause liver necrosis as well as renal tubular obstruction, but it can cause these at a dose 50 times higher than the recommended dose. So what we can take from that, this cyclodextrin is readily removed by CRRT or by hemodialysis. About in a 4-hour session, we can remove up to 50%, and significant accumulation occurs only in patients when dialysis is held for prolonged period. And hence, patients without underlying liver disease who are expected to undergo CRRT or an PIRRT or intermittent hemodialysis, they may be the best candidates because we can remove that cyclodextrin carrier during dialysis. And it is very important to take consent if the patient has renal dysfunction. And what about this drug in CKD, where we can fit this drug? So the optimal patient population are those who are on low flow supplemental oxygen therapy. It is better to start this drug within 2 weeks, preferably before 10 days, because it's an antiviral drug. We have to give it in the viremic phase. The duration of therapy is for about 5 days, and it can be used in ESRD patients with caution, monitoring the liver function test. And even we can use in patients who are requiring dialysis, requiring AK, provided liver functions are normal and monitored regularly. It's very, very important to take consent. And in stable CKD patients with creatinine clearance of less than 30, cautious use is suggested if the benefit is more considering the risk. So the guidelines vary in their opinion. IDSA and NIH, they are suggesting use of remdesivir, but WHO is currently, because of the solidarity, after the publication of that trial, they are now not recommending. So coming to the steroids, which are the game changer in the management of COVID-19, the steroids became the standard of care after this recovery trial. This trial has used the steroids in 6,000 patients who are hospitalized, confirmed cases of COVID-19, and they have randomized patients in a 2:1 ratio. And what dose they have given was, it's a 6 mg IV or oral dexamethasone for about 10 days versus usual care. What they have found is in patients hospitalized with COVID-19, addition of this dexamethasone reduced 28-day mortality in patients requiring oxygen supplementation or on mechanical ventilation. It is of no use in patients who are on room air and who are maintaining saturation. So if we see how much percentage of patients had severe kidney impairment, approximately 8 to 10% had a severe kidney involvement. About 15% of the patients were on invasive mechanical ventilation. So what does this trial say? So we can use steroids in patients who are on invasive mechanical ventilation and who are even on low flow oxygen. We can have a benefit on mortality, but we don't have any benefit if we use on patients who are not on oxygen therapy. So this is the meta-analysis which was subsequently published, which also has shown the same results. We can use equivalent doses of dexamethasone, of hydrocot and methylprednisolone, and the benefits are similar. So steroids have to be started in all ICU patients requiring oxygen. No benefit in those not requiring oxygen. In fact, it can do harm. High dose steroids are not better than low dose steroids. It's not like that we start steroids on day one, and if the patient deteriorates, if we escalate the dose, there is no benefit. None of the studies have evaluated that, but we do such things in clinical practice that should be avoided. Preferably, dexamethasone can be given 6 mg OD for 10 days, even it can go up to 12 mg OD. And the duration of 7 to 10 days therapy or until hospitalization is advised. Then gradually we can taper it. More benefit is noted in those who are not on mechanical ventilation and not on vasopressor support. Once the steroid is started, timely de-escalation is important once there is a clinical recovery. And when the patient is on steroids, it's very important to manage hyperglycemia, and it's better to give them PPA prophylaxis and BP control. The next therapy which had a mortality benefit was this anticoagulation. Why this is very unique in a way that it has caused high incidence of thrombotic complications in critically ill patients, even on those who are receiving routine thromboprophylaxis. Studies have shown about 25 to 35% of ICU patients developed imaging proven pulmonary thromboembolism despite on thromboprophylaxis. So CKD is a risk factor for venous thromboembolism in critically ill COVID-19 patients. And these are the evidences to support standard prophylactic or a therapeutic anticoagulation. Most are retrospective studies. And all 4 studies, with this evidence, we have included this anticoagulation as a standard of care therapy. So whom to give anticoagulation? All ICU patients, they need anticoagulation, and those who are having a D-dimer of more than 1000 nanogram per ml with normal platelet and normal coagulation. Yes, there are risks with anticoagulation. Major bleeding is noted in 3% of patients who are on therapeutic and 1.7% on prophylactic anticoagulation. And even those patients who are not on any novel anticoagulants, it's novel oral anticoagulants, 1.9%. So preferably we use low molecular weight heparin. This enoxaparin 40 mg OD is the usual prophylactic dose, but this COVID-19 is a state of acquired heparin resistance, because if we use this dose 40 mg OD, we were not able to achieve the desired anti-factor 10A levels, and hence we used to give BD dose and in patients who are having the severe COVID-19. So the guidelines vary. There are so many different guidelines regarding the anticoagulation in COVID-19. There is no common consensus. And this is one protocol from the Cleveland Clinic, which is very useful in managing the critically ill patients. This is based upon D-dimer. If D-dimer is less than 3000, give prophylactic dose. If D-dimer is more than 3000, always screen for any evidence of pulmonary thromboembolism, which might be even occult. If it is positive by imaging, then you give the standard dose. If there are no evidence of pulmonary thromboembolism, then it's better to give high intensity prophylaxis in a way like BD dose. The doses are tabulated. What we use are tabulated in this table. So one concern is the anticoagulation for CRRT patients with critically ill COVID-19. So many centers use RCC to prevent the circuit clotting, but what they have noted is, despite the use of RCC, there was significant filter clotting, and the filter half-life is very short in the COVID-19 patients. So these are the 3 retrospective studies which have studied and got published. So what they have found is those patients who are on citrate, they have higher risk of clotting. But if they use systemic heparin, what they have found is the clotting of the fibers were very, very less. And if they combine the citrate and systemic heparin, the circuit clotting was still less. And even they have found surprisingly that using the direct thrombin inhibitor like argatroban has reduced the circuit clotting. Similar studies has been shown by Wen et al., where they have shown in PIRRT patients where citrate, the duration of dialysis session, what they can maximum achieve was about 4.5. But if they use heparin, the circuit life was longer. So consistently, the use of systemic heparin increased the filter life and the dialysis treatment duration. Citrate did not seem to extend the filter life, which is surprising given that citrate outperforms heparin in the general CRRT literature. So compared to the pre-COVID era, CRRT treatment in COVID-19, filter life was reduced by 50%. We need 9 times higher dose of heparin, and it leads to 2 times increase in the bleeding complication. And more the inflammation, more the clotting, and hence they have shown an inverse correlation with CRP. And always systemic heparinization is preferred. Carefully escalate the anticoagulation on case by case basis. So this was the approach to maintain the hemofilter pattern. See, it's better to give systemic heparin, and case by case we can evaluate, and if needed we can target 1.5 times to 2.5 times the APTT, and accordingly we can modify the dose. So coming to the last topic on immunomodulation. So this tocilizumab has shown benefit in initial observational studies from China, and even they have shown survival benefit. Subsequently, after that, many RCTs have published. These are the about 6 RCTs what I have shown here. And the inclusion criteria was very different. These were done before steroid was the standard of care. See, we can see here the steroid usage was hardly for 4%, 10%, 30% in some studies. And none of the studies have shown any mortality benefit in tocilizumab. Do they show survival benefit really? Yes. Do they? Yes, they show. So these are the 2 recent trials, REMAP-CAP and the recovery trial. This trial has been published some 20 days back in Lancet. What they have shown is in the REMAP-CAP trial, the inclusion patients who are included were patients on ICU who require organ support in the form of NIV, HFNC, or invasive mechanical ventilation, or the cardiac support, who are on inotropes. And what they have, the primary endpoint was the days of organ support free days till day 21. And what they have found is the median number of organ support free days was 10 days in tocilizumab group, and 11 is sarilumab group, and 0 in control group. This is another drug which inhibits IL-6. And what has been shown in the recovery trial is it's a randomized controlled open label trial. They have enrolled about 4,000 patients. Among them, 50% were on respiratory support. They included patients who are hypoxic, that is, who are having saturation of less than 92% on room air or requiring oxygen therapy with evidence of systemic inflammation. That is, they have taken CRP as a criteria. If CRP is more than 75 with hypoxia, they were the candidates for tocilizumab. And what day they have initiated the drug, it was the mean day what they have initiated was about 9 days, and what they have assessed was 28-day mortality. And what they have shown is there is survival benefit from at 28 days, and those patients who are on NIV, their chance to go for invasive mechanical ventilation was very less. And if you see this recovery trial, and they have included patients, about 6% of the patients were having severe kidney involvement. So which patient should be given tocilizumab? So this is the AIMS ICMR COVID-19 National Task Recommendation, what they published in the 22nd of April 2021. What they say is that tocilizumab may be considered when all of the below criteria are met. If the disease is severe, that is, the patient is admitted in ICU, if they are admitted, preferably to give this dose within 2 days of admission. And thus, patient should have raised inflammatory markers despite steroid use, and there should not be any evidence of infection, like there should not be any bacterial, fungal, or tubercular infection. So what we follow here is, if the patient is in ICU, we usually start with high dose steroids and observe for about 24 to 48 hours. If the patient is having increase in the oxygen requirement along with sustained increase in the inflammatory markers despite steroid use, if the CRP is more than 75 and if the procal is negative, we can consider tocilizumab and ruling out the contraindications, that is the infections. Always rule out pulmonary embolism and pneumothorax, as I have told earlier, if the patient deteriorates on NIV or ventilator. And this can be tried in patients with severe renal failure also. And this is another drug, JAK inhibitor, which is a baricitinib. This FDA has issued an emergency use authorization in combination with remdesivir, but this drug did not have any mortality benefit. Those who have contraindications to steroids, this drug can be tried. And there are other therapies which we try in mild COVID patients like azithromycin, lopinavir, ivermectin, doxycycline, colchicine, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, convalescent plasma. Now, everything is proven that there is no benefit in these therapies, but there are some other drugs what people are using in ICU. The role of IVIG, some literature are supporting that IVIG can be used in patients with severe disease, and bevacizumab, TNF inhibitors, itolizumab, and I've seen some centers are using this low-dose radiation therapy, and they have shown even benefit. So to conclude, mortality is 1.5 times higher in CKD patients who are critically ill. Timely intubation and low PEEP strategy in patients with good compliance lung. Remdesivir may be beneficial in patients on low flow oxygen. Steroids and anticoagulations, they are the standard of care for all ICU patients, and they have shown mortality benefit. Avoid overuse or overdose of steroids, and timely de-escalation is important. And tocilizumab, there is a role in limited subset of patients. Thank you for patients listening. And this is our Rajdhani COVID hospital, which is a 300-bedded hospital with about 100 ICU beds. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk on this topic. Thank you.